Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime. Cameron, I need to know.
That is what you do.
That famous lyric from Enrique Iglesias.
I can be your hero, baby.
I need to know. Is that who sings that? I need to know. Tell me, baby girl, 'cause I need to know.
Yes.
So I need to know, much like Enrique Iglesias, what is your take on the psychology of someone who ritualizes their crimes?
Somebody who ritualizes their crimes is usually doing it in a response to unresolved trauma. So the ritual, in part, is what helps alleviate whatever overwhelming feelings. But again, I am no professional. That's just my understanding.
No, I think that's perfect because a lot of the information I'm bringing you today comes from a docuseries show episode of Mark of a Serial Killer. And spoiler alert, there is ritual involved in the crimes I'm going to talk to you about today, but they don't explore any of the reasoning behind the rituals.
Usually in a serialized crime, there is a ritual or a modus operandi that is used that creates this identity of the criminal. Not of the person as a whole, but of the criminal aspect of them.
Usually leaving some kind of telltale signature.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say it's rare to find a serial killer who doesn't have some ritualistic aspects to their crime, whether it is for unresolved trauma or even just, this is what I did before and I didn't get caught, so I'm going to continue to do things this way because they've worked.
Are there any infamous rituals of serial offenders that you can think of?
Well, the Golden State Killer, or the original Night Stalker, or as we like to lovingly call him, the Tiny Peen Murderer, because everything else sounds fanciful.
Right.
And one of the most identifying features about him was how tiny his penis was.
You can just pick one, but what was a ritual one of them engaged in?
Okay, he would tie up, it was usually, he graduated to hetero couples, and he would tie up both the man and the woman, and he would take the woman to a different location, but he would sexually assault her and force the male partner to listen. He would also put their bodies, or their bound bodies, if they were still alive, on the bed, and then he would stack dishes next to them so that he could hear if they made any movement or attempt to get up. And then he would also go into their kitchen after committing sexual assault at the very least, and he would eat food out of their refrigerator, usually leftovers and whatnot. He also liked to pretend like he was already gone and then start to re-offend after his victims believed that he was gone and began to try to rid themselves of the circumstances that they were in, particularly the being tied up portion of things.
Wow.
But he would stalk first. So in his case, it seems like a lot of it was ritualistically just to not get caught, which was probably easy because he had a background as a police officer.
That'll help.
Yeah.
Today's case is going to discuss rituals and offenses. I know I've already shared that with you. So on December 18th, 1998, at West University Place, Texas, Dr. Claudia Benton, a physician and researcher at Baylor Medical School, did not show up for her scheduled afternoon lecture, a lapse that was really entirely out of character for Dr. Benton. According to Detective Sergeant Ken Macha of the West University Place Police Department, such an absence was completely unthinkable for her. So much so that she had concerned colleagues, multiple, reach out to the police for a welfare check, alarmed by the notion that Dr. Benton would miss a significant lecture. Dr. Benton's husband, George Benton, happened to be out of town then. Later, Sergeant Drew Carter of the Texas Ranger Division explained that Dr. Benton had stayed home specifically to focus on her work obligations. When police officers arrived at the Bentons' attractive two-story brick residence, a structure in warm brown hues, surrounded by precisely manicured shrubs, and adorned with this really beautiful, Christmas arrangement on the front door. I'm sorry, they showed me the home, and all I could think was, this is beautiful. I love this house.
She's a doctor and she works at a university.
Yes.
Which both of those things, to get to those points, I think that you would have to be a very disciplined person.
100%.
Very type A. And so then you're talking about the manicured yard, and I don't know how the warm hues of the home adds to this, but everything seems very like...
I think that you're underestimating just how gorgeous I thought this home was.
It had to be giving Buckingham Palace a fucking run for its money after the way that you described Maud Crawford's house. And then I found a picture of it. You said that it was modest. And I was like, if this is modest, I live in a dumpster next to a fast food restaurant.
Full disclosure, I didn't look up a picture of the house. I just assumed humble Southern beginnings.
She was an attorney.
Okay, but she was still a woman in the 1950s.
Just shows how little you think of women.
Sure.
Okay, but I thought you were trying to continue to build this idea of this is a person who is very not somebody who runs late, not somebody who would ever be described as unreliable.
And that's true too.
And has a beautiful home.
Beautiful. Just
great.
Gorgeous.
The Christmas decor on point.
Well, it was very simple and understated.
Which is great.
And what's crazy is the photograph that inspired this.
It sounds like she did barely more than me.
This photograph came from the crime scene evidence. And I was like, wow, this house still looks great. Police observed that the downstairs windows were locked and secured. Additionally, the house's entry points were similarly secured, and there were no signs of any kind of forced entry. Once inside to conduct the welfare check, the officers at first detected no one. The house was incredibly still. Soon, though, they heard a faint, vibrating buzz coming from the direction of the hallway. The subtle noise was emanating from Dr. Benton's pager, discovered lying near the bedroom door.
How old was she?
39.
Young.
Very young. As officers entered the bedroom, the situation moved from unsettling to horrifying. Beneath the covering, they could see Dr. Benton's legs, unmoving. A quick check confirmed that Dr. Benton had no pulse. Dr. Benton had been subjected to a ferocious and brutal bludgeoning. As Detective Sergeant Macha emphasized, blood spatter was all over the place, and that's a direct quote. And images taken at the crime scene validated that statement. There were substantial crimson stains dotted across the beige carpeting. The blood streaked across the door. Clear indications of an intensely violent event were everywhere. Alongside that vicious beating and the other signs, Dr. Benton also sustained numerous stab wounds. The bedroom appeared to be in total shambles, a graphic reflection of this unchecked violence that had occurred.
Was this her bedroom, or is this a bedroom she shared with someone?
From my understanding, this was the master bedroom of her and George.
Okay.
On a pillow beside Dr. Benton's body lay a large butcher knife, and upon removing the blanket, officers uncovered that a transparent plastic produce bag had been wrapped tightly around her head. So this episode really shared a lot of graphic crime scene photographs.
Did you say that she had been bludgeoned?
Yes.
But there's a butcher knife?
Yes.
Here's my initial guess when you talk about bludgeoning in a plastic bag, that the plastic bag was used. It was either used in one of two ways. It was either used as a means of suffocating somebody until they lose consciousness and then letting them come back, which can be something that is done in a torturous way, because you talked about rituals. Or the plastic bag was used during the bludgeoning to prevent blood spatter from getting on the person who was committing the murder.
Mm-hmm.
But it's weird that there's a butcher knife.
Bludgeoned, beat, stabbed, the plastic around the head, and really really extensive blood spattering across the room. Like, it was a very violent crime.
Mm-hmm.
The unnerving discoveries did not end in the bedroom. In the living room, Dr. Benton's driver's license had been taken from her wallet and deliberately set out on a bench next to her purse. Detective Sergeant Macha viewed this as a chilling detail, suggesting that the killer took the time to study her face, still focusing on her physical features after her death.
Was there blood on the ID?
There was not.
So how do they know that the ID was taken out after she had died?
I think that more will make sense as we continue.
Okay.
Further inquiry by Sergeant Drew Carter disclosed that the killer seemed to have spent considerable time rummaging through the Bentons' belongings. The home was in absolute disarray. Mattresses overturned, personal possessions had been thrown around, and the perpetrator had torn open various Christmas presents and taken some, left others, from what I understand. And investigators were really left with this kind of image of a crime that seemed both strategic and off the cuff. Thomas McHenry, an author and juror, would later detail this bizarre aftermath by saying that, quote, the killer took tins of cookies and Christmas items with them when they left. There was wrapping paper, tinsel, tissue paper, crumbs, all forming a trail. On the counter in the kitchen, a piece of fruit was left half eaten. It was evident that the murderer had lingered long enough to eat following the violent act, adding yet another disturbing facet to this crime scene.
It's weird that I was talking about the tiny peen killer.
When you were saying that about eating the leftovers in the fridge, it becomes more odd as I continue.
What I was saying?
No.
Or just, look, would it be absolutely life-altering and terrible to see any person brutalized in this way and to be the person who discovers the scene and the body and all of that? Yes. Almost more harrowing is the almost like Christmas morning-esque scene that is also going on in the living room. And I mean, obviously, like the food and the partially eaten fruit is weird, although DNA, but it's just... Maybe the most disturbing thing of the whole thing that you've said is some of the presents were opened, some of them were taken, and you're saying ritualistic, and I'm like, this does not feel ritualistic. This feels haphazard to open some presents and then only take some. It just doesn't even...
Well, and that's what struck these investigators so deeply was this idea that this feels like it took a level of planning, but it also seems like it wasn't planned at all. Sergeant Carter highlighted the abnormality of this behavior, like what you just did, stating that usually if violence happens in the middle of a burglary, it's because the intruder is caught in the act, and their immediate reflex is just to get away fast. Yet here, the intruder behaved very differently, indulging in food and taking extended time to peruse and dishevel this home. Intensifying the situation even further was the fact that Dr. Benton's Jeep Grand Cherokee was missing. Now, fortunately, this allowed law enforcement to quickly enter the details regarding the vehicle into the, quote, Detectives Crime Information Center, marking it as stolen and associating it with a homicide. I'd never heard of the Detectives Crime Information Center. Had you?
No.
Evidently, it's kind of this clearinghouse database where you can put in certain information and details related to vehicles and what crimes they're associated with, and it helps ping you if that vehicle's discovered.
Makes sense. Okay, have I heard of it by name? No, but I feel like I've heard of the system.
Yeah, the system, we knew it existed, but I didn't know it was called the Detectives, like Ownership, Possession, Crime Information Center. Dr. Claudia Benton, again, 39 years old, was a pediatric geneticist. She was also a dedicated wife and the mother of 11-year-old twin daughters.
God, you're going to say 11 children.
Sorry. That shouldn't be funny. It's awful and terrible. But no, 11-year-old twin daughters. Once her body had been identified, her husband, George Benton, received the terrible news.
Where was this?
Where did this crime happen? In the actual community is called West University Place, Texas, but it's near Baylor Medical School. It's out in East Texas.
I've got a question. Actually, what was the year?
Yeah, 1998.
Did this killer...
Okay, bitch. Why are you jumping the gun?
I had this on my list to cover. This is...
Oh my God. Yes.
Okay.
I knew you were going to know it.
Because I used to live and he was active in the area, and my mom was extra cautious at that time, actually locking doors and whatnot. It is wild to think that there were times in my own life where we did not lock the door. I swear this is on podcast schedule list of cases that I was planning to cover.
Sorry, I obviously didn't look at the list before I decided I would do this.
Yeah, clearly, and then got mad at me for knowing the fucking case.
I literally was looking through. The name of the episode was called Appetite for Crime. And I was like, love it.
You clearly said something and it pinged for me.
Oh, well, good. You can help me tell the story if I mess something up.
No, I don't know it that well. I don't know it well enough to be doing all that. You need to calm down. You're going to get to a point and be like, I know this case.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you didn't do it because I actually really enjoyed watching the episode of the docuseries. And the reason I asked you about rituals is because I wanted to give more insight into maybe what inspired them. So at the time, George was in Arizona with the couple's children visiting his relatives. Reflecting on his wife's life, George Benton described his wife Claudia as a loving wife and mother, a dedicated doctor, and further added that my wife really didn't have any enemies. My first thought was maybe it was some researcher or medical student who knew her from her career at the Texas Medical Center. And while George did not appear in this docuseries episode, they did have audio that explicitly, it was him saying this direct quote.
Mm-hmm.
Despite George's grief, West University Place police considered him a person of interest immediately, entertaining the possibility of a murder for hire scenario. According to Detective Sergeant Ken Macha, George's apparently composed demeanor in their initial interaction raised suspicions. Furthermore, the fact that George was physically away in Arizona at the time of the killing did nothing to discount the possibility that he could have orchestrated the events from a distance. The following day, after the notification of his wife's death, George Benton and his brother arrived for a walkthrough with authorities in the Benton home. During that walkthrough, George pointed out something notable. From Claudia's jewelry collection, only one piece of jewelry remained, a pearl necklace. George went on to share that there was a cultural superstition that he believed to be relevant. Some Latin American communities, and he did point to the Mexican community by name, regard stealing a pearl necklace as bad luck. Now, George speculated that this was the greatest indicator of the killer's background, implying that whoever murdered his wife was likely of Latino heritage. However, this observation
probably only furthered the police's belief that he was behind it.
Well, and it led me to feeling like I was intrigued. I'd never heard of this superstition.
Same.
And so the first thing I did was check with Google about Mexican and Latin American cultural beliefs, customs, and superstitions around pearls. Now, I couldn't find any explicit proof that any kind of Latin American folklore treats stolen pearl necklaces as a source of bad fortune. However, in many Latino traditions, such as those in Mexico, pearls are linked to sorrow or tears. A familiar superstition warns brides against wearing pearls on their wedding day, as pearls may symbolize tears that will fall during married life. Now, interestingly, a number of Asian cultures hold the opposite perspective, associating pearls with the moon and good luck. Now, with that being said, I did reach out to a good friend of mine who was a Mexican national and is very aware and proud of her Mexican heritage. And I said, can you help me understand where something like this would come from? And I do want to share with you what she shared with me. And at first, she said, the only thing I know of is not gifting them for a wedding because it symbolizes tears and sadness. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow, I just read that, but this is what this man suggested. And she shared, that's probably more historical than superstitious, I would say. I know that there were sections in Mexico popular for pearls along the Gulf of Mexico. Back then, it was the Sea of Cortez. But when the Spaniards came, of course...
The Gulf of Mexico had changed names? That's wild.
Yeah, from the Sea of Cortez, which honestly, if we're going to change a name, change it back to that. That sounds really cool. The Sea of Cortez. Mm-hmm. But I don't know any of the historical implications of that, so don't. But when the Spaniards came, of course, they stole everything from the natives. I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere in the midst of all that, there were bad things happening to the Spaniards while sending off the pearls to other parts of the world that could have stemmed bad juju comments like that.
See, okay, this is, sorry to go too millennial, but I was thinking about how in Harry Potter, the Elder Wand or the Wand of Destiny or whatever usually is...
It's so funny that you're acting like you don't know. Like, oh, maybe.
But the Elder Wand has a bloody history, and it's believed to be maybe bad luck to have it by some people, but what ends up happening is somebody's like, I can't be defeated because of this wand, and so then they get killed because of it. So I almost was wondering if maybe the Spaniards were coming over and they were not just stealing it, but maybe killing people to stake claim over the pearls, and that was giving the pearls the bad, like, juju-y? Is juju okay? Like, can you say juju? Because otherwise I'm going to say jujubee.
Oh, I hadn't even thought about that. I don't know. But shout out to Margarita for giving me that historical perspective and sharing some of her knowledge and wisdom with me. She's wonderful and amazing. And thank you.
Thank you.
So law enforcement promptly began a neighborhood canvass in the hopes that they would discover a witness or any suspicious happenings that were maybe documented or seen, but local residents had little to report. Nobody remembered anything remotely unusual that night. Investigators confronted the puzzling array of scattered possessions, half-consumed food, and the disquieting display of Dr. Benton's ID. They wrestled with whether these odd details had been deliberate, tokens of a killer's twisted psychology, or if they potentially indicated some kind of deeper or ominous motive, or nothing at all. 5 months passed.
It would be hard to know with that scene.
It would be. The Tasmanian devil came and destroyed your house. Was it intentionally? Was it just because they were dissociating? Was it a...
It's the fact that they didn't open all of the presents.
That really got you, didn't
That's
it?
Really... It's really throwing me off.
5 months passed, and on May 2nd, 1999, in Weimar, Texas, roughly 90 miles to the west of the Benton's home.
Oh, yeah, I know where Weimar is.
Mm-hmm.
So Weimar is only about 40 miles from where I grew up.
So that would make sense why you or your mother or anyone in the area would have been concerned.
I remember, so I would have been, 9 at this time, right around there.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my mom being concerned because this serial killer, which is usually not something that you're really aware of in real time, that it's a serial killer. Usually it's retroactively applied to it, but we knew that there was a serial killer that was...
Maybe don't divulge that quite yet.
Oh, wow. Can I just say it and bleep it?
Yeah, that's fine.
And that was concerning for my mom because of our proximity to such a place.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I feel like that is maybe where my interest in true crime was born. Like
wow.
Yeah, kind of in this case, because I remember asking a lot of questions.
This is your origin story. This is your origin case with true crime.
Kind of. I mean, my mom has other connections to other cases, like the Austin yogurt shop, which I will probably cover at some point, but it's just I gotta build up the nerve to do that because I want to do it justice, and it's going to be a big case to tackle for me.
Hear that, listeners? You're going to get a multi-part episode in the future.
Multi-part? No, your ass is sitting there listening to me hours on end. But yeah, I remember, I was not even double digits at this point when this case was relevant to my life.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't it have been really wild if I was like, oh yeah. Then I started talking about eating the food and stuff, and it was in reference to, like, what if this was the case that I thought of whenever I talked about ritualistic killers?
So back to Weimar. May 2nd, 1999.
10. I was 10 now.
Just 90 miles to the west of the Benton's home. Another tragedy took place. Local pastor Norman Cernick and his wife Karen did not come to Sunday services at their church.
And he was the pastor.
Yes, the pastor.
Yeah, these are prominent figures.
That's his one day of the week to work.
Whoa. Did you hear that? All of the pastors listening
listening to our podcast. No, really, if you're pastoral and you're here, thank you. We're glad you're here.
Is pastoral?
I know it refers to like scenery. Wait, okay, hold on. Ever relating to shepherds or herders, which what is a pastor if not a shepherd? Ever relating to the country or country life, rural, charmingly simple and serene. And then lastly, of or relating to a pastor or the duties of a pastor.
So a footnote.
So yes, it's correct. but maybe not the most common usage of pastoral. I bet pastors use the word pastoral.
Okay, we get it. You think that pastors only work 1 day a week, and I think you probably also were implying like 3 hours at that. So carry on.
Okay, obviously nothing against Pastor Norman Cernick or his wife Karen. I guess they do other stuff during the week.
Yeah.
Okay, what do they do?
Okay, one, don't they typically have at least another service that's held throughout the week? They're ministering to people.
Sure.
They're doing last rites
Sure.
for people. They are counseling. They are
hospital visits, outreach,
right,
planning their sermons, planning their vacations, figuring out how to squeeze out more money from the church council and their congregation, figuring out upgrades to their parsonage.
How did we get here? This in and of itself is the exemplar for I will try to create the multi-dimension when you try to make something one-dimensional, because the fact that you have me
defending pastors.
Right.
What can I say? I'm skilled.
You're skilled at getting me to say things on this recorded line that sometimes are very unfavorable, and other times I'm defending pastors. So I don't really know.
Listen, the real truth, I do not think that of pastors, at least not by and large. So just a little light teasing from me.
I know, but you get me going.
I know. Okay, alarmed. The president of the church council. I'm sorry. I look at everything from the reference of my very small hometown church and the kind of gossipy nature of it.
What? Not small towns. You can't go in on small towns.
No, I shouldn't. Not like Weimar, which is, I think, actually a small town as well.
The biggest plot twist is you start going in on small towns, and I'm now defending them and telling you about their
the tables have turned.
Redemptive qualities.
And it's so fitting that the church president would think, it's my responsibility to go and check on the pastor. Is he alive or not? But in this case, that was the right decision. As the church council president...
Should they have all just gone home?
Okay, but why did the church council president appoint himself as being the person who needed to check?
Because he takes his role very seriously.
Very fucking seriously.
Well, who do you think people would say is the right person? You think they're going to say, let's go call the cops and do a wellness check? I don't think that it's far reaching, even if he is pompous enough to have decided this himself, that it was his responsibility. But I think that even if he hadn't, somebody would have been like, well, you're the president, and so you should do it.
Alarmed, the president of the church council hurried to their home.
Even though Hayden thinks that he shouldn't have.
He discovered the door partially open, or at least unlocked. It was kind of hard to discern from how it was described, but there was no answer when he knocked.
I guarantee it was unlocked.
I'm sure.
I don't know what church this pastor led, but I was raised Catholic, so that's what I know.
Mm-hmm.
And the priest lived in a house that was owned by the church that was next door to the church.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how other...
I think it can be. I know that in my limited experience, the parsonage was, located just in the neighborhood right beside the church. So I think that wherever the parsonage is, it is close to the actual church. And for those of you that don't know, a parsonage is a clergyman's residence that is sponsored and paid for by the church.
And in a pear tree.
So stupid. When the church council president stepped inside the Cernick home, he found a terrifying sight. Blood had stained the bedroom door, and as he ventured further, he uncovered the lifeless bodies of Norman and Karen Cernick. These crime scene images were gruesome and explicit. Karen, mostly undressed, was lying face down with her head at the foot of the bed and her legs oddly crossed at the top of the bed. Blood pooled near her head, portraying the violent nature of her death. Norman's naked body lay with his head at the head of the bed, where blood was smeared across several pillows, and there was stark blood spatter patterns stood on the wall behind them. And there was kind of this real intense savageness to the scene, because it looked like it had been kind of a ravenous fit. The way the blood was spattered, the bodies were somewhat twisted, And in this instance, as well as the earlier instance of Dr. Benton, they were partially covered by blankets, but also kind of not. The way that that was managed and handled was kind of confusing to me, almost as if he was trying to give the women a level of modesty. Mark Young, an FBI profiler, noted the extreme rarity of such violence in Weimar, a small town where homicides hardly ever happen. In fact,
one of the pros of small towns actually is that
homicide's not common.
The crime rate is usually lower.
A double homicide like this.
A double?
A double.
A double homicide.
A double homicide.
Homicide.
Homicide. Como se dice homicide?
No, we're not going to como se dice homo anything. I've got a question.
Okay.
This murderer, who we haven't named yet, I wouldn't say that he was frantic, because, right, there's nothing about it that was frantic in either of the crime scenes. But do you feel like the word frenetic is maybe...
I can see that being appropriate.
His crimes feel very frenetic to me. Like there's a level of organization that is mashed up with disorganization, almost maybe to throw off investigators, to...
You say frenetic. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
You say frenetic, and it almost makes me think of the actions as being like Newtonian in nature, because a body in motion will stay in motion unless another force acts upon it. And it seems that whatever it is that triggers the murderer to begin the activity isn't stopped until a certain threshold is met. That only in that instance does his actions seem uncontrolled or willy-nilly. But then once that's concluded, we go back to a level of calm, of stasis.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you were saying to me, but I think that's kind of what you were saying to me.
Maybe. I don't even know what I was saying, but it was just one of those
Frenetic
things.
is a good word for it.
Yeah, that's how it feels, because if it were frantic, there wouldn't be so much of the staging and the putting the blankets over and the positioning him this way and her that way or whatever. But it's like it's all being done for a reason that is only going to ever make sense to him. So there's an element of that where it feels like others are not going to be able to figure him out as a result of processing the crime scenes.
And let me tell you, they will not. You are absolutely right. And we will never know. Both Norman and Karen were beaten to death with a 12-pound sledgehammer, a method that evoked the brutality that was seen in the Benton murder. The Cernik's photo IDs were again laid out, echoing the same grim practice of the murderer. And once again, a piece of partially eaten fruit was found, further cementing a link to Dr. Benton's case. So again, these IDs were laid out kind of in this pristine condition, and this time it was both of them.
Like he's mentally cataloging his kills, probably.
Absolutely. Young considered the Cernik crime scene unusual and focused on the killer's deliberate and methodical acts. The evidence implied the offender had stayed in the house well after the murders, what they perceived to be as an act of defiance and control. Young posited that the display of the IDs was a psychological mechanism, a way for the killer to reaffirm superiority over the victims and the entire environment. Mark Young, the FBI profiler, is actually quoted as saying, he's basically saying, I controlled this. I dominated this crime scene. I was in charge here.
Is that before or after they have determined that this is a serial killer?
So these are thoughts that he had in real time.
Okay.
Everyone that I mention in this case, this episode of the series that I watched, is literally people who worked on the case. And you can see it, like news clippings of them being involved with the case as it unfolded. And so it's really interesting to hear from them recount what was happening in real time. And it seems that when he shared this control domination charge, that they weren't for sure yet that they were connected, but it was way too similar to not be. But they couldn't say that officially.
They knew about the two cases.
Yes.
In the same...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they knew about both cases. And
that was the question I was going to ask you a minute ago, was whether or not because you've got the partially eaten fruit and the laid out IDs. Was that something that you were adding as a similarity, or had they already put that together? But you're saying that they had already.
Well, and this is the case where the FBI starts to become involved. This is when the FBI enters the picture. I think the idea is that these local police departments, or maybe the Texas Rangers, were handling it, and they were like, oh, this is same MO.
Mm-hmm.
And the FBI started to get involved at that point.
Well, similar MOs. Probably not a butcher knife found in Weimar laying next to the victims.
No, there was not. There was also no plastic bag around a head, but the house was ransacked like before.
Yeah, and indicated by him hanging out there for a while. But of course, what rush does he have to leave? The occupants of the home are no longer a threat to him.
Young's analysis depicted an offender who had killed before and was very likely to strike again. Consequently, the FBI sent a warning to every reachable law enforcement agency, calling for vigilance and cooperation. Sergeant Drew Carter of the Texas Ranger returned to the investigation in May of 1999 after learning about the brutal Cernick murders. The parallels to Dr. Benton's case were too blatant to dismiss. Both involved victims who had been bludgeoned to death, a killer who seemed to linger in the victim's home, a disquieting use of food, and the display of personal identification. Carter immediately got in touch with the FBI, drawing explicit comparisons between the two horrific crime scenes. Even with these really strong similarities, officials struggled to find a clear and demonstrable connection. Dr. Benton and the Cernicks had no apparent links, and the crimes occurred 90 miles apart, absent any tangible motive uniting them. The perpetrator's exact motive remained a chilling unknown. At that juncture, investigators were contending with two crimes they believed the same perpetrator had committed, yet they lacked a definitive unifying factor. Besides the startlingly similar modus operandi, the investigation had come to a standstill until a crucial development jolted everything forward. Dr. Benton's stolen Jeep was discovered at a motel just off of I-35 in San Antonio, Texas.
Oh, that's close.
Yeah, pretty close.
A mile or two.
The local team dusted the Jeep for prints, finding multiple latent sets. Those fingerprints were swiftly scanned and entered into AFIS, or the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, in an effort to confirm the killer's identity. Then, in what felt like an unexplainable stroke of fortune, a match returned. The prints belonged to Ángel Maturino Reséndiz. I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about Ángel. Reséndiz was born in 1959 in Puebla, Mexico, in a place called Izúcar de Matamoros.
Beautiful.
Thank you. From the moment of his birth, his life was marked by trauma. Family accounts indicate that right after being born, he was dropped on his head and knocked unconscious. I know.
Right after?
Right after he was born. And it gets worse.
Okay.
This was the first in a line of painful experiences that would define his early years. When Reséndiz was merely 3 years old, he fell from a building, sustaining serious injuries. I'm sorry, it's not funny, but watching your face when I said at 3 years old, he fell from a building.
Well, because you famously give me a hard time if I try to introduce sympathetic elements for a character that is not a sympathetic character. And I just feel like that's what you're doing right now.
Well, buckle up. He sustained really, really serious injuries with this fall, and the exact context of the incident is unclear, but it underscored the precarious and difficult environment that Reséndiz was growing up in.
I think it also helps explain the frenetic nature of the crimes.
It certainly would have affected his development. By age 6, another significant change took place. His mother remarried and arranged for Ángel to live under the care of her brother, Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez. According to some relatives, Angel's aunt and uncle, having no children of their own, indulged him, spoiled him. Other relatives, however, shared a much darker version of events, alleging that Rafael sexually abused Ángel for the majority of this period.
He went by that name, though, right?
He did. He used it as an alias.
Okay, because that's the name that I knew him under.
If that allegation is true and accurate, it would represent a major trauma compounding the neglect instability, and physical trauma he had already endured. Outside of the home, life only served up more violence and humiliation. Ángel was considerably small for his age, an easy target for bullies. And on one occasion, he was struck so brutally with a brick that he bled from his nose and ears. Over the years,
Honestly, this brain has just taken a beating.
a literal beating.
Yeah, probably not the organ that you want to have take this much brute force.
Nah, you want to beat up that pussy?
Wow. Good God. You think that's coming out? That's not coming out. Everyone's going to see you for the crass monster that I have to put up with. It's so delicate.
Oh, you're such a delicate flower. I forgot.
I am.
Over the years, psychologists have remarked that repeated head traumas of this kind could lead to neurological damage.
Good.
Often observed in the histories of individuals who later manifest violent behavior.
Mm-hmm.
By the time Ángel turned 12,
Okay, sorry, we should be past this, but how hard does a child have to hit another kid with a brick to cause bleeding from both the nose and the ears?
I mean, it also makes me think, where in the hell could he have been hit? It also doesn't identify an age, but we know that that incident happened before he was 12.
Making a murderer.
By the time he turned 12, Ángel had fled his uncle's home. It remains uncertain whether he was attempting to escape the abuse or the severe bullying, or a combination of all of the stressors. Regardless, his situation spiraled further when he found himself living on the streets, dealing with hunger, loneliness, and continuing threats.
He had siblings.
He did. Mm-hmm.
How many?
I don't remember exactly. During that phase, Ángel began sniffing glue, a destructive coping mechanism that is sometimes common among the houseless population. Ángel's hardship continued to intensify. Sorry, I just can't believe there's more. Like, I know there's more. I got this information from Serial Killers, the podcast. At age 13, while swimming near his mother's home, Ángel was allegedly sexually assaulted by a group of boys. This new assault only deepened the cycle of trauma, reinforcing his experiences of betrayal and isolation. By the time he was a teenager, Ángel had already survived a tragic tapestry of violence. It was these building blocks investigators later theorized that culminated in the personality of Ángel.
He chose his victims at random, right? Should I let you just carry on? Okay,
yes.
Fine.
Sorry. For that one, yes, please. Although one might think that identifying Reséndiz through fingerprints ended the mystery, in truth, it was the start of a maddening and protracted pursuit.
Yeah, he was always like 2 steps ahead of them.
Way ahead of them. Originally from Mexico, he had been deported several times following various criminal convictions. Burglary, identity fraud, assault, financial offenses were just but a small list of the many crimes he had committed and been convicted of. Despite these many run-ins with the law, he never maintained a consistent address, possessed no formal employment records, owned no registered vehicle, and through all of this, tracking him was made more difficult. Oh, he also had 18 plus aliases. And every time he had been convicted, every time he had been arrested, he used a different alias. He always had a different name.
Nice.
With the new fingerprint evidence,
It's almost like a bitch list.
Kind of like a bitch list. It's all the same bitch, but yeah.
Maybe not for the episode. I'm having a hard time not constantly going back to the traumatic injuries to his brain and that form of brain damage, and then the crime scene, because, you know, there are mental illnesses that could also produce something similar. But one, I think traumatic brain injuries are more commonly linked to violence. But even once we had a third crime scene, that the trained eye should be able to review the details of the 3 scenes and be able to identify that this is probably somebody who had suffered a traumatic brain injury at least once in their life.
Yeah. And we're talking about someone who had a few TBIs.
Right.
At minimum.
Right. But I feel like that should be part of the profiling this killer, which they probably were trying to do before they had the fingerprints. But also, even if you have a name, even if you know who you're looking for, you still need to profile them, because you need to know what level of violence to expect when you do find this person.
Mm-hmm.
Is this somebody, because sometimes they're like, okay, I'm caught, and they just surrender.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes they don't go quietly.
Yeah.
So
They up the ante.
Lord, do they.
So with this fingerprint evidence, the FBI and the Texas Rangers officially team up. They are like, game on. We are in this together.
You love to see it. You love to see different departments working together, because sometimes too many are too proud, and then they up the ante by refusing to work with somebody else or to get help.
Yeah, get into a pissing contest.
Mm-hmm.
So the Texas Rangers were actually able to fast track the DNA testing from both Dr. Benton and the Cernyx crime scenes. And this turned another hit for Reséndiz, whose DNA was a part of the system. Yet, even holding both fingerprint and DNA proof linking him to savage homicides, investigators were still at a loss for his whereabouts.
Right.
Reséndiz was known for having transient habits, including rumors of frequent border crossings, which rendered him elusive. Reséndiz was able to remain so elusive by making use of the United States and Mexico's railroad system. His method of transportation to cross the border, to cross states, to cross this vast continent of, well, just part of the vast continent of the United States and Mexico, was through the rail system. FBI Special Agent Bobby Knox Eckerd recalled the mounting frustration. No known residence, no known vehicle, no known workplace. It was like chasing a ghost. Desperate for leads, the FBI and the Texas Rangers shifted their strategy, hoping to make sense of Resendiz's bizarre behavior. They focused on possible motivation or any clues in the way that he lingered at a crime scene. Dr. Ramon Laval, a criminal psychologist, offered a disturbing interpretation. He's quoted as saying, "The killer has a need for intimacy after committing such a horrendous crime. Staying there for a while, eating, and leaving crumbs is his way of connecting to his victim. He doesn't want this to feel like a random killing. He wants to believe there's a reason he chose that house and that victim." So to your credit, you asked earlier if he chooses victims by random, and the answer is yes. But in his mind, it is not random. Reséndiz does not believe it's random. And the reason I say that with such confidence is that Dr. Ramon Laval isn't just a criminal psychologist. He was the criminal psychologist that was tasked with determining competence of Reséndiz in his trial.
Can't wait to get to that point. But I had a question. I had a thought. It was there and now it is gone.
Well, if you find it again. Oh,
I got it. I found it. Please. I'm a professional ADHDer.
I was about to say professional podcaster.
Well, it sounds like it's not verifiable whether or not he was sexually abused by his uncle.
Yes, that's correct, but it does seem highly likely.
Well, I was going to say, it seems highly likely that he was sexually abused by a caregiver of some sort, or somebody who should have been caring for him, if he's taking this violent act and then seeking intimacy after. It feels very similar, especially for somebody whose brain experienced so much trauma while it was developing that it would have stunted some of the development and damaged other parts. So it feels like that makes sense to me, that somebody who was sexually abused by a caregiver and who had a traumatic brain injury would then perpetrate violence as a means of then creating a level of intimacy with his victims.
Yeah, I think at its most basic concept is that why is there such a strong tie between violence and intimacy for this perpetrator?
Right.
Investigators made use of the FBI's extensive technology and resources, and they began operating primarily out of the Houston Division headquarters of the FBI. Key data from the Benton and Cernyx homicides were entered into to VICAP, or the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And I want to do a quick explainer. Established in 1985, VICAP helps law enforcement agencies cross-reference details of unsolved violent crimes. The system's objective is to pinpoint patterns and
peninsulas
and potential connections that might be overlooked. When the Benton and Cernick murders were uploaded into VICAP, they generated a pivotal lead. Mark Young, the FBI profiler who had been assisting in the case, reached out to Sergeant Drew Carter of the Texas Rangers with urgent news. A murder in Lexington, Kentucky featured haunting similarities to the Texas crimes. Although the Kentucky crime scene reportedly lacked the display of IDs, everything from the bludgeoning to the brutality to the pattern of behavior all coincided with the same characteristics of the Benton and Cernick cases.
Which makes me think of something that I didn't add, I think, out loud, but I definitely thought it, because with rituals that serial killers have, they kind of evolve over time. They're kind of always shifting just a little bit. And so likely once he established the laying out of the IDs, that would always be an element of it, but there could be other things that were added into it.
You're onto it, because this Kentucky incident happened 2 years prior to Dr. Benton's killing.
In between Dr. Benton's killing and Pastor Cernick's murder, how much time had elapsed?
5 months.
Okay.
And then it was a 2-year period between Kentucky, which is starkly different than all of the other cases, actually. There are a lot of similarities, but it is also very different. And I'm going to get to that now in just a second. But 2 years between Kentucky and Benton, then 5 months between Benton and Cernick. August 29, 1997, nearly 2 years before Dr. Benton's tragic death, a terrifying assault took place in Lexington, Kentucky. Holly Dunn and Chris Meyer, both college students and dog lovers. I assume they were dog lovers because the photographs that were used of them had Holly Dunn with a black lab and Chris Meyer with a golden retriever, and they were both really cute.
Cuties. I thought you were going to take me somewhere that I was not okay with.
Mm-hmm.
For the record, I would prefer if you never bring me a case where an animal is injured or killed.
I would agree to that. Okay. I also would like you to not do that to me.
I'm going to do my absolute damnedest. I will probably jump ship at any point where I'm like, oh, Fido? I'm out.
Yeah. So these two college student lovers had been out for the evening at a party. And after attending a party that was near some railroad tracks, they decided that they would take a stroll along the rails that evening. What was supposed to be a calm and loving walk turned horrific when a man suddenly appeared out of the shadows. He demanded money, and before Holly and Chris were able to process the threat, he attacked. And with overwhelming brutality, the assailant crushed Chris using a 52-pound rock, ending his life almost immediately. The attacker then turned his fury toward Holly, beating her with a wooden board until her jaw was broken and her face bloodied. I literally have this to not make noise. Why is everything making noise?
Well, I guess it's true. I am also a professional podcaster. If you could sort yourself out over there.
Jesus Christ, I know. Next, he dragged Holly into the brush. The word used in the news source isn't a term we would typically use. We would say sexually assaulted, but the news source used the term raped, and then stabbed Holly through the neck using an ice pick. The attacker believed he had killed Holly as well and disappeared into the darkness after covering Holly with leaves and some other materials by the tree.
You started talking about the details of how he approached them and asked for money, and I was like, wait, did somebody survive this? But you're saying that Holly did survive this.
Holly Dunn survived.
Wow.
That was literally my next line is, incredibly, Holly survived.
But little did you know you had already told me. With the details that you included.
That's true.
Usually those details are only available if there is a surviving victim.
Well, Holly did survive and emerged as the sole known survivor of Resendiz's brutal crime spree.
Wow.
She actually has a book titled Soul Survivor. It was Holly's ability to endure, to fight through trauma, and subsequently describe her attacker in precise detail that became the very first strong lead to identify the so-called railroad killer. Not only did Holly recall key features of the assailant's face, but she also gave law enforcement an unusually complete account of his mannerisms. And in a remarkable show of strength, Holly cooperated with investigators as soon as she was able. Now, Holly's detailed description led to one of the most accurate composite sketches I've ever seen, and I'm going to share that with you now, and I was hoping you might just be able to explain what you think of the sketch compared to the actual picture of the perpetrator.
Okay, this is what I'm seeing. She definitely was very kind in her description based on this sketch, because again, I know this guy. Like, I already could see his face. The sketch of him looks young, nice hair. The glasses are the same, but the sketch of him is far more flattering than the actual picture of him. His face is elongated in the sketch, and there's something about the actual picture of him where in the face there's kind of this like lostness that is not present in the rendering of the person who attacked her and killed her friend. If I saw this sketch, I would think I was looking for like a 19-year-old human. And he is not a 19-year-old human.
Do you remember when I wanted you to talk about how accurate this depiction was?
Yeah, this is not the depiction that I thought it was, and it's not right. It's not it. You know what? Scratch all that. Identical. Twins.
No, they're obviously, okay, they're not identical. And you're right. There's almost kind of is the right word dour? I don't know, but there is this energy, this vibe to the actual image of Resendiz that I don't think the sketch artist could capture.
Yeah.
But I do think for most purposes, this is more than serviceable. It's pretty accurate.
Honestly, maybe it was just a really long 2 years. Maybe he did look like the sketch and he's just weathered.
So I think you're right. And I also do think it is fairly accurate.
Okay. Yes. We've referenced the Madeleine McCann case before, did not cover it. I don't have any plans to cover it. But in that case, there's a literal drawing that looks like an egg with hair.
Oh, God.
So this is much closer. For a sketch from a person who was traumatized and has had to fight for her life
in
literally.
The dark, stabbed through the throat with an ice pick.
For a rendering of this man, it is a really good sketch from a sketch artist. Yes, because it looks like an actual human, and not all of the time is that the case.
Right.
Sometimes it's a circle with 2 dots and maybe there's a nose and mouth.
Me as a sketch artist. The Kentucky State Police shared this drawing with Mark Young, who, again, had already zeroed in on Resendiz. Young was struck by how perfectly it captured the suspect's likeness. Still,
all right, Young.
Still, he recognized that they would need more than a compelling sketch to link Resendiz conclusively to the Kentucky case. Namely, they needed DNA evidence or physical proof. Lexington authorities divulged that they did have DNA samples from Holly Dunn's assault, but that they had never had them tested. This revelation spurred serious questions as to why that crucial evidence had remained unexamined for more than 2 years at that point. But regardless of that oversight, with the new lead tying it to the FBI's open investigation, officials moved quickly. And for their mistake, the Lexington authorities did in turn use a private aircraft to expedite the samples to the FBI for DNA analysis.
It's what,
97 when Holly Dunn is assaulted.
Okay. Until very recently at that point, relatively recently, you would only test DNA if you had somebody to test it against. I don't know when CODIS was.
That's how they were able to identify Resendiz's DNA so quickly. It was already in a system the first time.
Okay. I know from last week that the UK's national database was not set up until 1995 or 1996, just because within that 10 years, you have to build a database.
Right.
So I guess I was using that tidbit to try to inform this piece.
So the creation of the National DNA Database in the US had already began in 1989.
That's a great year.
In 1990, the FBI began a pilot DNA databasing program with more than 14 state and local laboratories. And the national level of CODIS, as we know it today, was implemented in October of 1998.
98?
Yes.
Okay, so after this.
Yes.
Okay.
It's national.
It was all new,
Right.
right? So I think that you maybe forget about some of the new practices. It's not necessarily the first thing you think of. Let's enter this into the database.
We're talking about Kentucky. Not any Kentucky slander. I'm just saying, I assume things move a little slower.
Sounds like slander to me. Everybody's coming for you.
The results came back swiftly and left no room for doubt. The DNA from the Kentucky crime scene matched Ángel Maturino Reséndiz. This was another explosive breakthrough, suddenly drawing a line from Holly Dunn's survival story to the murders in Texas. Investigators now realized that they were indeed dealing with one man, someone with a track record of crossing state lines and leaving behind scenes of gruesome violence. This automatically meant that this case was no longer a Texas state case, but rather one of national significance. Crucially, it became evident to authorities.
It became evident.
Crucially, it became evident to authorities that every relevant crime scene was located in close proximity to railroad tracks.
I know you wanted that to be, but you already said it before.
Dr. Benton's home was within roughly 50 yards of the rails, and the same could be said for the Cernick's place.
50 yards?
Yes.
Well, there's no way that I lived within 50 yards. We were fine. What was my mom carrying on about?
And Holly Dunn and Chris Meyer had been walking directly along the railroad line. This revelation explained Resendiz's ability to slip in and out of various communities unnoticed, riding trains, traversing enormous distances, while bypassing standard checkpoints or highways. In the eyes of the FBI, especially Special Agent Mike Millard, that finding escalated the level of danger that Resendiz posed. Train hopping provided Resendiz a fluid, anonymous method of travel. A large-scale manhunt quickly ensued, involving the Texas Rangers, local law enforcement, the FBI, and, I didn't know this was a thing, the railroad police.
It makes sense.
Investigators realized that if they failed to curtail his movement, he could continue killing at random across the nation. The FBI actually sent out directives to every agency with jurisdiction.
Yep. Jurisdiction.
Jurisdiction. Janice Dickinson. To every agency with jurisdiction near rail lines, urging them to revisit unsolved murders involving this kind of close contact bludgeoning, partially consumed food, and personal ID displays that had been documented in Texas and Kentucky. As a result, more potential leads poured in, painting a disturbing picture of a mobile killer exploiting the interconnected web of railroads. Not long after the Kentucky match emerged in the VICAP system, so this police chief of Hughes Springs, Texas, contacted the Texas Rangers with a tip about yet another possible related homicide. On October 2nd, 1998, just about 2 months before Dr. Benton's murder, 87-year-old Leafy Mason was found murdered in her home. She lived about 250 miles north of West University Place, and crucially, her house also sat extremely close to a train embankment. From my understanding, the train embankment was visible from her home.
Were all of his victims either single women or heterosexual pairings?
Yes.
Maybe it was less random than one might believe. You can probably look at a home and see the hint of a woman.
Leafy was known in her tight-knit community for her enthusiastic collection of vintage irons that spread across eras. And friends described her as kind and interested in history. When repeated calls to her house went unanswered, her neighbors alerted the police. Upon entering, law enforcement officials discovered her otherwise orderly home turned completely upside down, with items strewn everywhere. The source of her fatal injuries was horrifying. Leafy's beloved collection of irons had been used to bludgeon her to death. Many of these irons were found scattered throughout the home, and a few had been deliberately placed upon her body, as though the killer was leaving a theatrical display. And yet another echo of earlier crimes, Leafy's purse had been located in the bathroom with her ID extracted and placed prominently on top, eerily reminding investigators of Dr. Benton and the Sarnics. Additionally, several pieces of partially eaten fruit lay in the kitchen, further stamping the crimes with that signature element. The presence of these consistent indicators, particularly the ID display and the fruit, convinced authorities that Leafy was also a victim of Ángel Maturino Reséndiz. Learning about Leafy Mason's case, Sergeant Drew Carter felt a renewed urgency. He's quoted as saying, "All murders are callous in their own way, but this guy, he was pure evil. He obviously enjoyed what he'd just done. He would kill, and then he'd spend time getting to know the victim." The notion that a killer would linger for hours, rummaging through personal belongings or eating food, transformed these murders from acts of impulsive violence into extended and chilling rituals of domination. At this point, the FBI had labeled Reséndiz as a national-level serial killer, placing him under one of his aliases, Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, on their most wanted list. This high-profile classification led to intensified searches of train cars across the U.S., with authorities systematically checking freight yards whenever feasible. A dedicated command post was established for the explicit purpose of capturing Reséndiz, and again, this was located in Houston. FBI Special Agent Mike Millard remembered the extraordinary scale of the interagency collaboration. He counted at least 30 different agencies coming together, including the Houston Police Department, the Secret Service, the U.S. Marshals Service, the Texas Rangers, various local sheriff's departments, the University Police, and even Mexican law enforcement. Thousands of individual officers pooled their resources and shared intelligence. As the public grew more anxious, they flooded the 1-800 hotline with tips. Media outlets covered the unfolding case extensively, revealing that the so-called railroad killer could appear in virtually any community near train tracks. The FBI profiler Mark Young recalled how entire neighborhoods set on edge, and discussed how people who lived a few yards from the tracks, even some further, asked whether they should reconsider bringing their grandmother to a different location or moving to a different place temporarily. And Mark Young said that his answer was always just yes. If there's any doubt that you might be too close to a train track, move.
That's just so easy to do.
Well, not necessarily move homes,
Not permanently.
but
Yeah.
Local communities became vigilant, warning residents living close to railroad lines to bulk up whatever they could to secure their home, whether that be securing windows, adding additional deadbolts.
Yeah, definitely lock your doors, because
Mhm.
I just feel like 90s in Texas, small towns, you're probably not doing that, having grown up in a small town in Texas in the 90s. But when you leave here today, you are going to spend most of your time, primarily, if you go the shortest route, driving alongside a railroad track, suggesting that people move away from that, which I'm not saying is what they did. They didn't suggest that. He said that when people asked and if they had the option to do so, he said, yes, do that. But that is very disruptive. If you just pay attention to between where I live and where you live on your way back, that's a lot of people.
Right.
That's a lot of dislocation.
You're absolutely right.
Well, and I'm also thinking, like, of course, it's similar to a natural disaster. I was thinking hurricane, but then I'm also literally thinking LA.
Well, and then I think, okay, we're talking about early beginnings of our country and then its expansion. Railroads predate individual automobiles and 18-wheelers. And so where were towns and cities built? In proximity to
Along
railroads.
railroads. Right. And I mean, not only that, so I was going to say I've lived in towns that have had railroads before, which is just fucking stupid. Especially when you just said
No, you
that.
haven't.
he's probably picking up at and getting off at places close to where the train stops. Because if it stops here when you get off, it's very likely that you'll be able to find a place where it stops so you can get back on. You can't
Right.
guarantee if it slows down just to let another like train finish going by, or, you know, I don't know how trains work. You can't guarantee that that's going to happen again, is what I'm thinking. Plus, you can always hear when your ride is coming. You're not going to stray too far. Anyway, that's an aside.
The massive press coverage culminated in Attorney General Janet Reno issuing a statement on television. Agents, state and local law enforcement officers are involved in this effort, and we are going to continue to do everything that we can. Yet, even in the face of such a monumental manhunt, Reséndiz managed to strike again, evading capture. On June 4th, 1999, a full 6 months into the official investigation, he emerged to commit 2 murders on the same day, horrifying the public and fueling another renewed sense of urgency to bring him down. Sergeant Drew Carter of the Texas Rangers received an urgent call from the Houston Police Department about a gruesome scene in Harris County. Resendiz's first victim that day was Noemi Dominguez, a young woman who lived alone in Houston. Noemi was a dedicated student at Rice University, and she was full of promise and ambition. His second victim was Josephine Convica, a widow in Fayette County, a beloved member of her church and family.
Fayette County?
Mm-hmm.
Fayette County? Hell of a lot closer than Weimar.
Reséndiz broke into Noemi's home and brutally attacked her with a pickaxe that was her possession. That same pickaxe, stained with Noemi's blood, became the weapon he carried to Fayette County, where he murdered Josephine Convica in another savage assault.
Is it believed that he traveled there by train?
No.
Did he steal Noemi's vehicle?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Reséndiz stole Noemi's vehicle and drove the 90 miles,
No, it's that it was almost the exact same phrasing of my question.
Said, yeah.
Yeah.
He drove the 90 miles between the murders and Noemi's stolen car, leaving a blood-soaked trail of violence. DNA evidence confirmed Resendiz's responsibility for both murders, adding to the mounting case against him. In both homes, Resendiz left, and I want to point out, and I don't know if this is by accident or I don't know, there seems to be the least amount of information on Noemi's house and what was done there. Almost kind of glossed over. In both homes, Resendiz did leave.
I think it makes sense because out of everybody that you've said was murdered, it sounds like she was the one who explicitly lived alone.
Yes.
So Leafy may have lived alone, but it sounds like she had neighbors in her community that she was close with, so they would have been familiar with her home. But if Noemi didn't have anybody else that came over regularly, or unfortunately for you, if anything were to happen to me, you're the best reference that they have for the state of my home and what has changed.
And when they call me and they say, can you come look at this and see if anything's out of place?
You're going to be like,
No,
I'd be more surprised if things were in place.
If the perpetrator came in and cleaned up, that would be the sign. In both homes, Resendiz left his disturbing signature. In the kitchens was found
the ID laid out, chomped on fruit.
Partially eaten fruit lay discarded. However, in Josephine's home, Resendiz added an unsettling twist. He carefully arranged her body on her bed to appear peaceful, with arms crossed, eyes closed, and the pickaxe lodged in her head. Macabre details didn't end there. In one of Josephine's bedrooms was kept a toy train for her grandchildren. Resendiz took the time to set up this train set on that bed, an unnerving wink to his infamous moniker as the Railroad Killer.
Mm-hmm.
He pushed his taunting further, placing a copy of the Texas Herald on her couch, prominently displaying the headline, Railroad Killer Strikes Again. It was a chilling act of mockery and defiance. A clear message to investigators that Ángel was aware of his growing notoriety and relished it.
Yeah, it almost sounds like if we're looking at which came first, the chicken or the egg here, once he found out that they had pieced everything together and they knew they were looking for him, Now some of his acts feel performative.
It's so funny you say that because my literal next line is Dr. Ramon Laval saying, he's mocking the FBI, taunting them.
Yeah.
It's as if he's saying, you think you're getting closer to me? Watch this. Catch me. He's telling us I was here, the railroad killer. He's bragging.
Well, and to stage the body peacefully with such a gruesome symbol of violence, or literally the antithesis of peace, as a part of that scene, it's very, very that.
As investigators examined Josephine's home, because this was quick, they were alerted almost immediately as soon as the body was discovered. Investigators examined Josephine's home, and scent dogs tracked Resendiz's path from her house to a nearby railroad track. The scent abruptly vanished, confirming yet again that he had escaped via the same method that allow him to evade capture time and time again: trains. By this point, Resendiz has been connected to 7 murders, and his trail of destruction showed no sign of stopping. Recognizing the need for a new approach, Sergeant Drew Carter determined the best way to capture Resendiz was by reaching someone close to him. Authorities aired his profile on America's Most Wanted, hoping to generate a lead, and the plan worked. A distant relative on the West Coast saw the broadcast and contacted the command post, offering a critical tip. The relative directed law enforcement to Resendiz's sister, Manuela Karczewicz, who lived in New Mexico. I know that last name, when I heard it, I was like, Karczewicz. It looks like Karki-Wixie.
It's beautiful.
Manuela admitted that she hadn't seen her brother in years and had no idea where he might be. However, she was willing to cooperate fully and help authorities connect with other family members. And Manuela made good on that promise. Manuela led investigators to Julieta Dominguez, Resendiz's common-law wife, who was located in southern Mexico.
His wife?
His common-law wife in southern Mexico, Julieta Dominguez.
I got a lot of questions.
Okay, do you want to ask? Do you want me to talk? Do you want me to...
Just talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
U.S. Marshals worked with Mexican officials to locate Julieta. She willingly spoke to authorities, describing her husband as a man who traveled constantly, but always returned with gifts for her, whether they be trinkets or jewelry. The families of Noemi and Claudia would later identify items belonging to their loved ones, further tying Resendiz to the murders.
So he was going home between
Yes.
these...
He was riding the rails into southern Mexico and taking home jewelry from his murders to his wife.
I mean, those are trophies.
Mm-hmm.
And then he probably gets to relive the thrill of the murders whenever she wears them.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees her wearing them. Interesting.
Julieta, who loved her husband deeply, was blindsided by the truth.
Yeah, no shit.
She
Hopefully no
described
shit.
her joy in raising their child together, only to discover that the man she adored was a cold-blooded killer.
What would you do?
What would I do?
No, not what would you do. How could anybody know that? I am always so fascinated, and I know it's problematic, but it is what it is, by the children who learn that their parent is a serial killer.
Mm-hmm.
I find that fascinating. I want to know more about how that affects your life. I'm not even sure that I knew that this man had a child.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I have seen coverage, have listened to podcasts over this case before. I've seen episodes of stuff. I've done my own deep dive on this before, but that was years ago. I don't remember all of the details.
You could just say that my reporting.
Honestly, your reporting is fantastic. You found information that I was not privy to. Some of this has been a refresher course, and some of it has been revelationary information. This is hats off to you.
Thank you so much. On June 6th, 1999, just 2 days after the Fayette County murders, the search intensified once again when a rail yard worker in Flatonia, Texas, spotted Resendiz. I'm growing tired of both of you exponentially.
My dogs have decided that it is playtime, so if it sounds like we're recording in a pig pen, those are the noises.
The worker had seen him near the same rail line that scent dogs had tracked following the Convica murder. This tip immediately immediately mobilized law enforcement. But by the time police responded to the sighting in Flatonia, Ángel Reséndiz was already gone. Frustration and disappointment consumed the lot.
Flatonia. I was like, where's Flatonia? Where's Flatonia? Flatonia, is that not in Fayette County?
I think it is. By the time police responded to the sighting in Flatonia, Reséndiz was already gone. Frustration and disappointment consumed the law enforcement team. The task force halted all nearby train traffic and thoroughly searched for passengers, but found no trace of him. Investigators resumed their nationwide manhunt, but once again, Reséndiz had managed to evade capture. 8 days later, on June 14th, 1999, Reséndiz struck again, this time in Gorham, Illinois. In rural Illinois, 51-year-old Carolyn Frederick and her father, 79-year-old George Morber, so not a couple, but a man and a woman, were found dead in their home. Mark Young was summoned to the crime scene and immediately recognized the parallels to previous murders. The proximity to railroad tracks, the brutality, everything pointed to Reséndiz. Investigators had to consider whether this sudden spike in violence was a deliberate acceleration. Dr. Ramon Laval speculated perhaps the idea that I will soon be caught drove him to hurry up and do as much as he can before he's caught.
And also, I understand that, the railway system goes everywhere, but it was all very concentrated in Texas. And so I think he knew that people were more alert and aware in Texas. So it kind of makes sense that he would go up to Illinois to, not necessarily Illinois specifically, but that he would go up north to put distance between himself. And he probably was aware that he was less likely to be caught. Did he ever go up into Canada?
No, not that we know.
Okay.
Reséndiz had stolen a truck from the scene, and that truck was later discovered 60 miles away near a railroad track.
Airport.
As information poured in from tips and investigative materials, authorities worked to construct timelines and movement maps. The scope of Reséndiz's travels was staggering, stretching from Washington state to Florida, the northeast coast to Southern California. He could and did travel wherever he wanted. FBI Special Agent Mike Millard explained that efforts were made to target trains Reséndiz had used in the past. However, stopping trains at such a frequency proved impossible. It would shut down America, said Millard.
Yeah.
The FBI increased their reward, offering $125,000 for information leading to Reséndiz's arrest.
It's a pretty penny.
That's a big chunk of change. In 1999?
Yeah, no, I mean, if I saw him, I'd phone it in.
I'd fucking try to tackle his ass down and hold him there. I'm getting that money, honey.
Honey.
This move sparked a new wave of interest, particularly in Mexico, where bounty hunters began actively searching for him. For them, capturing Reséndiz, whether dead or alive, made no difference. Meanwhile, Sergeant Drew Carter had maintained contact with Reséndiz's sister Manuela, telling her he'll have nowhere else to go and urging her to be ready if her brother reached out. 5 days later, Manuela contacted Carter with critical news. Reséndiz had in fact reached out to her, confiding that he was tired of running and had discussed surrender.
And that's, I think, what we should take away from this. Doing crime is exhausting, and save yourself the time. Don't do it.
That shit is so tiresome. It's so laborious. It's so exhausting. Why would you do it?
I guess you're just not tired enough in this economy.
Just be lazy. Watch TV. Stream a TV show.
The Traitors is good.
Real Housewives of Salt Lake City.
RuPaul's Drag Race, honestly. You've got so many iterations of it. You'll never get to watch all of it.
You'll never have to watch a new thing again.
You'll never finish it.
Manuela found herself in a really difficult position. She loved her brother, and she wanted to protect him from bounty hunters in Mexico who might kill him. Manuela informed Carter that Reséndiz wanted to negotiate the terms of his surrender. Dr. Ramon Laval explained that this behavior demonstrated Reséndiz's need for control. He wants everyone to know he's so powerful, he's in total control. Sergeant Carter asked Manuela to determine what Reséndiz needed to agree to surrender. Over several phone calls, over a number of days, she relayed his conditions. Reséndiz only wanted to surrender to the Texas Rangers, specifically Sergeant Carter. Carter agreed but insisted on controlling the surrender's location. They agreed to meet at the Zaragoza International Bridge in El Paso, Texas in 7 hours. And on July 13, 1999, a multi-agency task force gathered at the bridge. The Texas Rangers, U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, and surveillance teams coordinated their efforts, preparing for any scenario. Sergeant Carter received a call from Manuela during this time. Resendiz was hesitating. Sergeant Carter has shared that his only response to Manuela and Resendiz at that time was, there was a news truck and it was either now or never. Tell him if he's coming, he better come now because everyone's about to know. At around 8:30 to 9 a.m., Carter remembers standing on the bridge waiting. 30 minutes later, a truck appeared, and inside were 3 people. Resendiz sat in the middle, accompanied by at least one of his brothers. Carter later described the moment as surreal, standing face to face with the man he'd been hunting for 5 months. The long and grueling manhunt was finally over. Mike Millard of the FBI emphasized that law enforcement had no authority to act until Resendiz crossed the border into the United States. The international boundary was the key barrier, but Resendiz, as promised, finally walked across the Zaragoza International Bridge into El Paso, Texas. Resendiz approached Sergeant Drew Carter calmly, and Carter wasted no time, placing handcuffs on Resendiz and escorting him to a car to begin the formal process of his arrest. The railroad killer was in custody, but the saga was far from over.
Saga?
Despite the certainty of his fate in Texas, where capital punishment loomed, FBI profiler Mark Young expressed surprise that Resendiz would surrender voluntarily. With his capture, the next chapter of this case began.
Well, what's the alternative if he's exhausted from having to run constantly?
Exactly.
I mean,
But
come on.
He could have stayed in Mexico, but that did leave him open to the bounty hunters that had no issue with just...
Yeah, I don't know what $125,000 in 1999 money converts to pesos wise in 2025 money, but enough to take
it would have been worthwhile.
Enough to take somebody out. I'll take that much.
With his capture,
they're going to get more than some half-eaten fruit.
Resendiz would need to be magistrated, flown to Houston, and interrogated, a process that was just the beginning of what would become the second act in his story. The court assigned Dr. Ramon Laval, the criminal psychologist I've discussed extensively, to evaluate Resendiz and determine whether he was insane or competent. Laval recalled being struck by Resendiz's intelligence and sense of self. He described him as astute, knowledgeable, and utterly convinced that he was on a divine mission. According to family members,
he killed a pastor.
According to family members, Resendiz believed himself to be part angel, part man.
Okay, just by name. The only part of him that's angelic is his fucking name.
And Hell claimed that he was sent to Earth by God to carry out his will. He spoke of Michael the Archangel. Oh my God. Willow Pill.
Angle is wild.
He spoke of Michael, the Archangel, explaining that Michael directed him, who to kill, when, why. Resendiz viewed his role as eliminating evil, believing it to be his divine responsibility. Relatives also recounted
evil
that Angel frequently delivered apocalyptic religious sermons during his visits to Mexico.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to go back to evil. Because, so the couple that was walking along the tracks that he attempted to kill both of them, but Holly survived. Where did they just come from?
A party.
Okay, they'd come from a party, sure. And then he killed a pediatric geneticist, quite evil. And then a pastor and his wife. Picture of evil.
I think you're missing the part where Michael the Archangel told him when and why and who.
I'm not missing it. I'm not believing it.
In other words, he was described as a rambling fanatic. And
same.
His family noted how detached from reality he seemed. Julieta, his wife, said that he believed it was his duty to target people he viewed as immoral, including those he accused of practicing witchcraft, having abortions, or being part of the LGBTQ+ community.
I'm gonna always go back to the pastor and his wife. Or what about Leafy and her iron collection? 87 years old. Does that mean that she was...
I mean, he saw all the irons and thought idolatry.
The pastor!
Adulterer.
How?
I don't know. He could have... I'm not saying I think that. I'm just saying he, in his mind, He says that he thought that Michael was talking to him. Not that I believe that, but I also don't know.
Not me getting hung up on not the voices in his head from the Jesus, but getting hung up on the people being evil according to the voices in his head.
Yeah.
Okay, that's on me, honestly.
In March 2000 in Houston, Texas, Reséndiz went on trial for the murder of Doctor. Oh my God.
Is this a federal case? It's got to be if it's being held in Houston. Otherwise, the only one in that jurisdiction was Noemi.
I don't know.
Party. Well, you said they set up headquarters at the FBI location in Houston. So I'm assuming that that's where they're trying it, but that it is a federal case because he did cross not just state lines, but country lines.
Yeah. Went on trial for the murder of Dr. Claudia Benton. The prosecution relied heavily on physical evidence, including thumbprints, DNA, and the extensive collaborative investigation linking him to her killing. Throughout the proceedings, Reséndiz showed little emotion, an observation noted by a juror who described his behavior as eerily calm. Reséndiz pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, a defense strategy designed to avoid the death penalty.
And negated by him staging the scene with the woman with the pickaxe
in her head.
and her peacefully laying there.
Josephine Convica.
With the railroad set up on the bed with the
newspaper propped.
Correct.
Resendiz's courtroom demeanor unsettled many observers. One juror described how Reséndiz would stare at the panel and move his gaze back and forth as if studying them.
Like he did with the IDs. I'm personally not buying the insanity defense, but... No. Let me check with Michael the Archangel.
Adding another sinister layer to his courtroom behavior, Reséndiz told his defense attorney that he had placed a special curse on the jury.
Wait. No. We are not
special
saying,
little cutesy curse.
We are not saying that people had to be killed because they were evil, because they were practicing witchcraft, and now we are cursing people who are working in...
It's an angel's curse. He got it from Michael.
He got it from Lucifer.
Well, much like you, the jury rejected his insanity... rejected his
insidious insanity defense.
His insanity defense. And found Ángel Maturino Reséndiz guilty of capital murder.
If anybody is listening to that moment, I think it only makes sense if you can see the visual that goes along with it.
During the sentencing phase, Holly Dunn, the lone survivor of his attacks, took the stand to testify. The prosecuting attorney asked her if the man who attacked her was present in the courtroom.
He looks older, but yeah.
Holly did confirm that he was in the courtroom, and then turned to Reséndiz, looked directly at him in the eye, and firmly stated it was him.
Work.
The power of her statement was palpable, prompting guards in the courtroom to move closer to Reséndiz, who seemed as if he was about to lurch at Dunn.
That's
Is that a train? Hours later, Ángel Reséndiz.
That's him, but wearing a dunce cap.
I said hours later, but I don't think that's possible. Reséndiz was ultimately sentenced to death. The jury's decision ensured there would be no parole, no successful appeals that would overturn his guilt, and no second chance at freedom. Although he was tied to multiple murders, his conviction for Dr. Benton's homicide alone sealed his fate under Texas law. On June 27, 2006, Reséndiz was executed by lethal injection. His final words, spoken in Spanish, were, "Perdóname, perdóname," or "Forgive me, Father, forgive me, Father." He offered...
Where did the father come from?
I don't know. I'm literally just writing what I had heard in the episode. He offered no apologies or acknowledgments for the families of his victims, instead focusing solely on his own hoped-for salvation. Ultimately, authorities believe that Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was responsible for 13 murders in the United States and 7 in Mexico. Many investigators suspect that there are additional victims who were never definitively identified. Although he was only convicted of a single murder, Reséndiz confessed to 9 others, leaving questions unanswered for families across multiple states. His victims ranged widely: a kindergarten teacher, a grandmother, a doctor, a pastor and his wife, and college students. Even with his execution, some experts feel the full scope of his actions may never be completely uncovered, and the true number of his victims remains a chilling enigma. And that's the story of the railroad killer.
I must say, I'm glad he's dead.
No one mourns the wicked.
No one lays a lily on his grave. I mean, I already complimented you in the middle of you telling the case.
You did. It was very nice.
I feel like I have a question.
Oh, God.
I know. Here we go.
I can't possibly have the answer. But I'll try. I'll see.
Actually, not so much a question, but so often do people who have some sort of brain damage, which he did, and untreated, maybe even undiagnosed mental health issues that perpetuate violence against others, so often is that tied back to religion.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll never understand. Okay, you said adulterer or whatever. You were trying to come up with things that these people maybe could have been accused of. But how does any of that, and I know all sins are equal, right? But how does committing another sin cancel that out? How does putting yourself in that, like, how does committing a murder? I don't understand that. How does committing a murder?
I think the idea is that you're removing wickedness from God's creation.
But you're creating wickedness by perpetuating murder.
I definitely understand what you're saying, and I agree. But if I were...
Can you imagine if you were like, I disagree?
I disagree.
I do not agree. I think that all adulterers should be murdered and the killer is absolved.
I would know a lot of dead people.
Good God, look at me.
Wouldn't we all?
Using the Lord's name in vain. Just as bad as killing somebody.
No, I hear where you're coming from, and I agree. But I don't think we can ever understand his mentation to agree that would allow us to say with certainty what was happening.
No,
which isn't what you're advocating or saying. But...
Right. I'm just pointing out that there are some discrepancies here when we're going to say that it was, the angle telling us to do things.
Yeah.
Any word on if it was acute or obtuse?
I think it was right.
Oh, it didn't sound like it was right. It seemed very wrong. Well, as I mentioned, I was aware of this case, maybe forgot some details along the way. And honestly, you did a really great job of taking a behemoth of a case and retelling it in a way that I didn't feel like a lot was lost, because there's so much to this case. I think I've listened to podcast coverage of it that was several episodes long. And I think that with the potential for this case to be several episodes of a podcast long, you really did it justice for the time frame in which you told me this case.
Thanks. We could have easily taken this case and serialized it and turned it into multiple parts, but that's not our format.
No.
And I think while I appreciate serialized podcast episodes, if you can give me all of the pertinent information in one sitting, that's what I prefer. And so I'm glad that that came across effectively and that you felt that the whole and the integrity of the case and the story was conveyed.
Yeah, masterfully done.
Wow, this is the most complimentary I think you've ever been of my case.
Yeah.
Which isn't a read, but I can tell that you genuinely mean it. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for putting so much into it.
Thanks. You're welcome.
A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review.
Recommend us to a friend.
And to make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram. And what would be really great is if you remember this story, if you were affected by this story, if you had a parent who was worried that you were going to be railroad massacred, write in on the Instagram. Tell us what that was like.
I don't know how you managed to sound so old, but write in on the Instagram.
I didn't say write in on the Instagram, did I?
Oh, I can't wait for you to listen back to this. Our email address.
Telegraph us at End of Crime Pod.
While Hayden is finishing his pudding over there, our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com, so feel free to reach out with questions or episode suggestions.
And thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.